let's dive right in. We have a few topics to talk about, and only like half an hour to go through them. So can you start with a very brief introduction, what you have done in the past, what you're up to now, before we start talking about ecosystems?
Yeah, sure. So I've been in the game industry for almost 25 years. In the early days, much more on the technology and 3D graphics hardware side. Then I spent many years at the RGDA. I was the executive director between, I guess it was 2000, 2009. And so that was a really exciting and interesting opportunity to work with game developers and game industry stakeholders from all across the world. Then I left the IGDA and was doing more sort of business consulting and ecosystem development work, which led to the starting of Execution Labs, which was at the time a very rare seed fund in games and early stage incubator for game startups for indie studios. And then now, more recently, I'm doing more consulting again, working with governments around the world on the ecosystem and economic strategy.
All right. So we already said this word a few times. So this leads me to my first question. How do you define an ecosystem? And before you answer, I love this topic, by the way, and in my introduction speech at Dev.Play from 2 years ago, I don't know if you've seen that, but I talked a little bit about this, and I defined a game development ecosystem as the combination of several things, such as having a critical mass of studios and people working in the industry. Investors interested in the gaming space, education opportunities, and government support. Would you agree with this definition? Would you have something to add? How do you see this?
Yeah, well, I mean, a lot of this is sort of a bit fuzzy. I think what you described would be a cluster, right? So a cluster is like an ecosystem that is working and is generating opportunity and success. Whereas ecosystem is more like the base, right? Like there is an ecosystem, whether or not it's operating well or producing success or opportunities, there's still an ecosystem. So I think the ecosystem is the more base environment, which is the combination of schools and studios and talent and resources and funding and all those kinds of things. But it could be zero, right? And so your ecosystem is, well, there's nothing. And so it's a very barren ecosystem. Whereas if the ecosystem is really excelling and there's a bit sort of what you said, where there's opportunities and investors and government support and lots of businesses, well, then that's like a high performing ecosystem. And at that point, you would sort of label that as a cluster. So you'd say, oh, that's a game industry cluster where there's enough of those kinds of resources that are enabling success to emerge. So it's sort of on a spectrum.
Okay, so interesting distinction there. So can you give us some examples of thriving ecosystems or clusters?
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm standing here in Montreal. Montreal, I guess I'm biased a little bit, but Montreal is one of those thriving ecosystems or a game cluster, and kind of recognized as being one of the top 5, even top 3 game clusters in the world, where you have very rich environment, a very rich ecosystem, where you have many schools in general, many game schools specifically, many universities with game degree programs. So there's a lot, et cetera, et cetera. There's a lot of talent pipeline. We have many studios. So I think something like 300 or 400 studios. There's about 14,000 game development professionals in the city. So one of the highest densities of game professionals per capita in the world. And that ranges from, Ubisoft with 4,000 workers at their studio, all the way down, of course, to startups and indie and small teams. Then we have a tremendous amount of government support at the city level, at the provincial level, at the federal level as well. There's investors that are active. There are many community level support programs. So we have like a co-working space called Gameplay Space, which is a hub where all the game developers come for sort of pre-pandemic, come for events and workshops and networking activities. We have various trade associations, conferences. So all those support structures, mentorship programs are all in place. And that whole ecosystem works to generate success, to create opportunity, to enable blockbusters and global export revenues to be created and careers to be built and success to happen. So that's one example that I know very well. Just another quick example would be Helsinki. I think no one would deny that Helsinki is a very successful ecosystem for producing mobile game success. And again, there you can see the combination of the studios, the investors, the government programs, education, very strong community and support structures and mentorship programs, and all of that kind of working in unison to generate large-scale success.
So you touched on, you mentioned government support, state support. How important is this element in building that thriving ecosystem? Can it happen without state support?
Yeah. Government support is one of the tools that can be used to, grow and support an ecosystem. It is not necessary. Like if you don't have it, it's not an excuse to not make progress and not to do good work to grow the industry. Certainly, if the government is there helping you and providing, funds and resources, that's absolutely an advantage. But I wouldn't say it's necessary. If you look at the United States, for example, arguably the first, if not the second, game sector in the world after China. Not only do they have no support from government, given the very kind of capitalistic, open market type environment, but in many cases, their government is fighting the game industry, right? Like over the years, the government has actively been trying to control, censor, the industry and sort of get in its way. A bit less so today. Over the years, it's been sort of up and down relationship with the various state or American governments. And yet, despite the lack of any kind of incentives or support, the game industry in the U.S., continues to thrive. So it can play an important role. Of course, in Canada, government had a heavy hand in supporting and growing the industry. I think one of the challenges is what kind of support, what kind of intervention, and the answer there often depends on what stage the ecosystem is in. So, for example, if you're in a region where there's not much industry and you're trying to encourage new startups, new businesses to get going, entrepreneurship, etc. If you're in that kind of environment and you offer tax breaks are not exactly helpful to start up. Normally, the way tax breaks works is you have to, operate for a year, spend money for a year, in some cases even generate revenue, but not always. And then at the end of your fiscal year, you file your, income taxes with the government, and then it gets processed. And 6 months later, you get a check back from the government saying, here's your tax incentive. Now, that's how it works in Quebec. Obviously, it depends where you are. But if we are starting a new studio today, and these amazing tax breaks from the government are coming 18 months in the future, then they don't really help to catalyze new startup activity because it's still kind of a burden on us to survive 18 months. So in that situation, the government should be providing seed funding and kind of, encouraging maybe angel investors to get a write-off on their taxes to encourage more risky investment at an earlier stage, just as an example. Whereas if you had already a very large industry with existing companies that are, have operations, and you want to, for example, encourage them to increase their headcount, Okay, well, then you provide a tax incentive that reduces the cost base per employee. And so if I had 100 employees, well, now if I have a 20% tax break, well, then maybe I can afford 120 employees. And then if every company adds 20 more employees, well, then you're sort of, growing the base. But I mean, there's all kinds of details here, but the point is that a government can play a role to support and nurture a regional ecosystem, but it needs to be very intelligent about what kinds of tools or what kinds of incentives and interventions it does, depending on the status of that ecosystem.
So, okay, so I was actually going to ask if there's a proven formula to support the various support options. So it sounds like there isn't, and it depends a lot on the needs, on the specific needs of the local or regional industry, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, Catalin, that's one of the most important lessons. When I work with governments, I'll often get calls, from all over the world saying, "Hey, we realize game industry is good business. We want more of it in our country. We heard you are the expert at this. Come help us." And oftentimes they've done a bit of homework and they see Canada and say, "Oh, well, Canada had this tax incentive, and look at Canada, it's so amazing. Help us build a tax incentive." And then I go in and I look at the state of the industry and I say, "No, the tax incentive is not going to help you today. Maybe that's a tool we use 5 years in the future or even 10 years in the future. But, we have to look at these elements and the status of the talent pipeline and the maturity of the companies and all this kind of stuff." And yeah, I mean, sometimes they're excited by that and they're willing to kind of explore different approaches. And other times they're like, "Oh, well, we just wanted to do the easy thing of implementing a tax break, and now that doesn't seem like it's going to help, so we'll forget it." So that's you're absolutely right that you have to go in, understand the state of the industry, what's going on the ground, and sort of design a strategy customized for that region.
So we talked about the type of support, but let's look at it from another angle. So some countries do offer support for cultural related things, and others go more towards R&D. Does it matter in the end, or is there a good practice here, or again it depends on the objectives of each country?
Yeah, well, exactly. It depends on the objectives of the country. What happens is, if the support is coming more so from a culture ministry, for example, then what's supported tends to be very artistic and cultural, and so that may encourage beautiful games to be made, compelling games with poetic stories and so on. Which is wonderful if the goal was to create, festival-winning games. If the goal was to create jobs and to create commercially viable, exportable games to generate, revenue and tax income for the country, et cetera, then encouraging artistic poem games is probably not going to generate 100-person studios. And so that's not a judgment call on the value of art and art games. All I'm saying is, if you're supporting the creation of art, that does not always sort of work well to then also have economic impact. And so, in fact, that distinction is quite common, where in a given country, you'll see usually one or the other taking leadership. For example, Switzerland, it's the Swiss Arts Council, which really is the most supportive and active agency in the country supporting games. And so a lot of the Swiss games are very beautiful. They're winning festivals, very creative, but they still tend to be relatively small studios and not sort of mega sales generating games. But I mean, it's the Swiss Arts Council. So that's their objectives are more artistic and cultural, whereas in Canada, more often the support is coming from, Ministry of Economy and Innovation, and more the sort of economic side of things, where they are trying to drive headcount, export revenues, and so on. So the nature of the support and the incentive does change depending what which entity is providing the support, and then ultimately kind of which goal or what goals you're trying to serve.
Okay, let's. That sounds great. So basically, the answer is it depends.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. Yeah.
So moving on to another topic, education. So this is actually, talking about Romania, this is a sort of a pain point. There are very few options, right? Not to say there aren't any, but there are very few options for people who want to do game development as a career. They want to do specialized studies. They have maybe a couple of master programs and some private courses, but that's about it. So the question is, how do we build education when there are very few options?
Yeah, that's a tough one, and talent pipeline is critical. It's hard to build an ecosystem. It's hard to build a thriving cluster without a strong pipeline of talent. And what happens is if you don't produce that talent locally, the companies that are growing will go abroad. They'll go outside the country to grab talent wherever they can get it, because they have to sort of feed the engine. Part of the challenge is opportunities, right? Like the schools. Now, I will admit I'm not familiar with the Romanian education, system and challenges and how it works and so on. But in many countries, universities will provide career paths, they'll provide educational paths where it leads to career opportunities. And if the career opportunities are not evident, then it's hard to motivate the schools to produce those courses because they're concerned about filling the classrooms, because in part that's how they're funded or how they generate revenue. And so there is often this kind of chicken and egg problem where you need to have an industry so that jobs are available, so that it motivates schools to provide courses, but you need the courses to educate the students to create there's a bit of a chicken and egg issue of supply and demand. So part of it is educating the educators that there are job opportunities and there are demand for jobs, and if they realize that, oftentimes then they'll be more willing to create programs to generate the students. So that's part of it. And often, that might be more the kind of state-run or kind of public schools. On the private side, there's always opportunity to create a private school to educate. The other challenge is also the teachers. Right? If you get some, historical state school or government-funded school to provide a game design course, but it's taught by, some old web designer person that has never made a game in their life but knows how to use Photoshop, how valuable is that in the end? Like, what kind of quality students are you producing with that professor? So there's a lot of challenges there. It's definitely something that you need to focus on in terms of talent pipeline, but then that even becomes a broader question. Some regions, if the population is just not big enough, then you have to streamline the entry of new talent. You have to make it attractive for talent from neighboring countries to come to your region. You have to streamline visas. Obviously you're you're in Europe, I guess maybe it's easier if you're in Europe, but worrying about visas and talent coming in and all that kind of stuff. You just have to be thinking about talent pipeline. Like, that's one of the most critical elements of ecosystem strategy.
Right. Yeah. So it is. You're right, and some speaking from experience, companies here are starting to look outside the country for hiring people, because it's getting challenging to recruit internally. And in our case, a lot of the hard work in building the current workforce that we have today has been done by the several multinational companies which have been present here for a long time, we're very grateful to them for basically building the industry, building the people working in the industry. But we do need like a longer term strategy. So yeah, like you said, it's a tough one, but it's something that we do need to tackle as an industry. So next question, and this is something that I think is close to both of us, having been involved in such initiatives in the past. And I have an opinion about this, but I will wait for your answer first. What the role of incubators and accelerators? How viable are these types of entities today?
Oh yeah, I mean, I think we can do a whole conference just on this one question. Yeah, I mean, where to even start? So the things that incubators and accelerators do are extremely valuable. So the idea of mentorship, the idea of access to networks and partnerships, helping with pitches, providing early stage funding. Often incubators, accelerators do have some funding, so early stage seed funding. All of those elements are absolutely critical, right? Like those are major catalysts for startup creation, and importantly, increasing the probability of startup success or indie success. Now, the question is, do those things need to be structured in an incubator or an incubation program? That, I think, is more of a it depends. It depends on who's there. It depends on structures. It depends on all kinds of things. So for example, with execution labs, sure, we combine those ingredients into execution labs and sort of delivered that as an incubator and a seed fund. But if there was a seed fund, its own thing, and there was like a community-led entrepreneurship support program given by the local university as one thing, and there was like an agent in the town that had access to all the publishers in the world and investors, and they were helping out local studios, like, so you can sort of decouple those things, and you could not have an incubator in your region and still sort of do all that stuff. So I mean, maybe this is more of a kind of an academic way of looking at it. I think all of those things are super valuable and make a difference, whether or not they're packaged as an incubator or an accelerator. I'm sort of indifferent at this stage. In some cases, it's easier to combine those things and deliver them as a kind of a combined package. But so I would say incubation and acceleration, the verbs, 100% critical. Incubating or incubators and accelerators, the thing, I'm sort of indifferent, and I could kind of structure and solve the puzzle in different ways depending on the situation.
Okay. Cool. Thanks.
Well, now, Catalin, I'm curious to hear your point of view.
I was hoping maybe I can get away. So, my take on this is that incubators and accelerators really work best. Not that they cannot work in other ways, but I think that they really work best when they are, created, funded by public institutions that are interested in the very long-term growth of the region, and they are. So it's really about the long term, and not at all about short term. So it's basically about driving value on for many years into the future.
Well,
and
yeah, I mean, ideally you would have both, right? I mean, ideally you would have, I mean, just off the top of my head, an incubator that was more publicly funded and was there to coach and support and enable more startups to get started, and kind of really being not, I don't want to say democratic, but like helping everyone. We've been given money from the state to support everyone who needs help and encourage them to, be entrepreneurs and gain access and so on and so on. And I think that's valuable, and it would make sense that would be public funded, because that would be very hard to generate a profit from if you're kind of this community service to support, everybody. Whereas Execution Labs was venture funded, we were private. And that sort of forced us to really be hungry to find the studios, the entrepreneurs with the most drive, with the biggest ambition, and to back them and to give them an unfair advantage. And that kind of laser focus is not possible if you are a state funded or public funded, where your job is kind of to help everybody. So ideally you have both types of structures. You have something that's more kind of community run, public funded, there to support everybody in their journey as an entrepreneur. But then you also have more private things that go in and sort of laser focus and really boost up the ones that have huge potential. So I would say a combination of a bunch of things actually being the ideal approach.
Okay, makes sense. And we have a question from the audience. So what is your opinion on grants for concept and prototype?
Yeah, I like that. Part of the challenge is games is it's a numbers game, right? The more shots on goal, the more chances you have to create new IP, the better or the higher probability you have of an IP breaking through. And so I like the idea of doing very early stage, call it prototype grants or concept level grants that encourage the creation of new IP. Now, the one trick is that it really has to be money for a prototype. What often happens, and I've seen this in other countries, where you'll have, for example, a $25,000 grant for game developers. And the intent is to make a prototype. But what happens is a lot of developers will submit a proposal for a game that they can ship with $25,000. They say, look, the government's giving a grant of $25,000. It says prototype, but let's just make a game with it. And so they propose a game they can make for $25,000. And so they're happy because they can make a game. But the chance that $25,000 game has any real hope of success in the marketplace is extremely low. And so it really has to be, okay, I'm going to use the 25 to make a prototype, because that prototype will enable me to go to a conference, to an event, to investors, to get $1 million or 500,000 on top of that. So you really have to use those grants as a stepping stone to the larger investments from investors or publishers, and sort of not allow developers to kind of trick you and just take the 25 and ship a 25K game. Then that's not really helping in any meaningful way.
Thank you. And another one. So this is interesting. Should private game development schools try to build their own games along with their students?
Well, yes. All game education, regardless of private, public, state, whatever, all of them should be making games, right? Like every game student should be making games, whether private or public, like certainly one of the end goals as you graduate, it should be you have a finished game. Now, obviously, the scale of that game, it's not going to be Fortnite, or League of Legends. As a student teams, in school, the scale is much more modest. But entrepreneurship, business, marketing elements are stuff that's not often taught. And so I would go one step further and say that not only should it be to complete a game, but before you graduate, you should have shipped that game, right? Even at just posting it on the App Store or sending it to Steam, to kind of complete that entire cycle of not just making a thing but launching a thing. and going through the steps of what that means. Now, what could be really interesting is if you did have a kind of incubator attached to the school, so that as students kind of went through and graduated, the ones that did have promising projects, then they kind of do an extra year in the studio incubator, where now that team can like actually ship the game and try to build a studio. So there's definitely some interesting things there, but game students absolutely should be making complete games by the end of their program, and ideally shipping them to complete that sort of learning process.
All right. So, Jason, we totally went past the time we had, but this is always fun to discuss. We could probably talk like 2 more hours here easily. Any closing thoughts for today, though?
Yeah, I mean, just the idea of ecosystem development, I think is critical in kind of taking a holistic view on all of the ingredients in your region, and working on it, with intent to improve the ecosystem. It generally benefits everyone, and you want to work with academia, you want to work with industry, you want to work with government, and kind of get them all to collaborate. And it's totally fine to be inspired by what you see elsewhere in the world, but it's very rare that you can kind of copy paste those recipes. So be inspired, but then really think about, what's unique about your region or your country. And then it should be more obvious what you can do. And you can call me. I mean, this is the kind of work that I do. Is I help regions and governments build up their ecosystem. So I love it. It's so interesting. It's kind of like this meta design thing, yeah, I mean, it makes a difference. It really does.
Thank you very much, Jason. And hopefully, in future editions, we can have you in person on stage.
Please. Awesome.
Thank you so much, talking with you as always. You feel free to stick around on Discord and talk to people. I saw some people saying hello to you on the stage chat.
Awesome.
See you around.
Thank you so much.
Bye.